Good morning again and welcome. Today we're going to look at some of the historical markers that mark the Greek state, and the focus is really on the 20th century, but there is a continuity of these markers. So we're going to talk about Asia Minor, we're going to look at the Greek Civil War and how it is connected with Asia Minor directly. We're going to also look at the European Union, our entry into the European Union and what that means. And finally, I'm also going to finish off with Cyprus. But on the Cypriot issue, I'm going to probably let a small documentary on YouTube that I found that I think is fairly good to give you an indication of the invasion and its implications. So it's in English. The screen is large enough for you to take a look, and therefore that might be a bit more appropriate on this issue. So let us begin with the National Schism. In Greek history, in modern Greek history, the Greeks historians refer to this period ethnikos dichasmos, and it literally means the tearing up of Greek society, the tearing up, schisma. And that schism involved two personalities, but they were both personal and ideological. The handsome fellow on this side is the king, King Constantine I, and the other handsome fellow on the other side is Eleftherios Venizelos, a Cretan who represented the Liberal Party in Greece. So the Liberal Party was very different to the Conservatives in Greece. It was very much modelled on the same party that was in Britain at that time. Very briefly, the National Schism was a clash between these two individuals and which path Greece should take. And I'll move on to give you some examples. Venizelos was in favour of entering the First World War. Constantine was not. He wanted to retain neutrality, not because he was necessarily pro-German, but of the royalist links that his family had. So when we talk about the first 3-4 decades or the first part of the 20th century, remember, it's the royal households that controlled and managed most of the conflicts, including the First World War. So, what Venizelos does, he says to the king, we should enter the war with the Allies. By doing that, we'll be able to gain more territory and have an advantage down the track at the negotiating table. The king disagrees, dismisses Venizelos. Now that's very, very significant. He dismisses Venizelos, and that nearly leads to civil conflict. So what Venizelos does is, with the newly acquired territories, i.e. Macedonia, he establishes a government in 1916 in Thessaloniki with the support of the Allies, with the British and the French, with the support of the Allies. Greece is virtually split in two, what I would call older Greece, so from Athens and down, which were largely more pro-king, and northern Greece, which was largely more pro-Venizelos. Constantine then, with the support of the Allies intervene, they put enormous pressure on him, and he abdicates. As a result, Greece joins in the last 10 months of World War I, and is able at the end of the day to acquire territory. Which territories does it acquire? It acquires what we call Thrace, the last bit of what we called Western Thrace, which the Bulgarians entered, occupied, lost, and ceded to Greece. Now, without that intervention, and without Venizelos entering on the side of the Allies, there were no bargaining chips, in my opinion, on the table when they sat down to divide the spoils of the war. However, that is not the significant outcome of this dichasmos. The significant outcome of this schism was that it polarised Greek society, and geographically polarised Greek society. So anything that was down from Athens again was largely pro-king, monarchists. North, Venizelos, Crete, Venizelos, the islands, Venizelos, and some more liberal territories were with Venizelos. The schism was very deep. Make no mistake, the schism was very deep, to the point that monarchist officers were replaced, then Venizelos officers were replaced, the civil service was purged, and so forth. The root of this issue, and I'll come back to this, the root of this issue was there was no definition or no understanding of constitutional power. So the king had the view that he had oversight of Parliament, while Venizelos was of the view that the majority party had oversight of Parliament and not the king. The meddling of the monarchy is not new. In Great Britain, it took 200-300 years to evolve to get a constitutional monarchy. In Greece, that did not happen. So what you have is, from the 20s, you have a situation where the monarchy intervenes based on their perceived powers at the time. So these powers were neither defined or clear, they were fairly open-ended. So the king decided to take his own course. And I'm not trying to put an anti-monarchist spiel. You'll see later on that I don't take that course. But in my opinion, that's what was the core of the issue. Nevertheless, the great outcome of the Second World War in Greece's entry, the Allies say, come with us and we will reward you. Now, last week I was asked a question, which I wrongly informed one of our participants here, about why they didn't give Crete back, Cyprus. The king was asked by the Allies, join us in 1915. If you join us in 1915, we'll give you Crete. The king declines that because he wanted to remain neutral. So the Allies were furious with him and don't give Cyprus back after the war. So that was the main reason, and to give you an example of the impact of the monarchy. The most significant outcome after the First World War, and this should be seen as an extension of it, was the Treaty of Sèvres. The Treaty of Sèvres basically said the defeated Ottoman Empire will now be split into a whole range of bits. The Greek part, the Greeks will acquire the region around Smyrna. You can see further down, this would have been the Ottoman Empire. So from what we know, only this with Ankara at its centre. Armenia would have reclaimed its traditional ancestral lands. French mandate, so the French would have had that. The Italian zone down here, the French zone, and the Greek zone here. So what you see, you have a fragmented modern day Turkish state. So for a minute, let's take a look at this from the Turkish perspective. They lose the war. The Treaty of Sèvres is signed by the Ottomans, but rejected by the Turkish nationalist Kemal Atatürk, who tears it up and says, we will fight and we will try and fight you wherever you take us, particularly if it's a guerrilla war. So he rejects that. He brings his forces back and he takes them, he withdraws to this area, thinking that once the Greeks arrive, that it will be a guerrilla warfare. Like the Greeks in the 1821 revolution, the Turks did not have a standing army at that time. What they did is they had irregulars. In other words, guerrilla fighters. So as you can see, this is the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. The Greek forces land in Smyrna in 1919. Soliadis, Evros land in 1919 in May. The region becomes a protectorate zone. So what allies and diplomacy of the time is, if I take a territory and we know it's contentious, what I'll do is I'll turn it into a protectorate, and from a protectorate I'll ask them to have a vote of referendum whether they want to join Greece or not, and that's how we would be incorporated into the Greek state. The so-called Smyrna zone. From the time the Evzonians stepped foot, literally from the time they stepped foot, they had a strong resistance movement against them. That does not mean that the vast majority of the population in that zone didn't feel Greek or were not Greek or did not have roots tracing back 3,000 years, nearly 1,500 years before the first Turk stepped foot in Anatolia. What it means is that the Turkish population during the Ottoman Empire, which stretched right down to Egypt, to Libya, right down to the Levant, into the Balkans, was largely concentrated here. That's what it meant. Where do these people go? For them, this was their last stand. This was literally their last stand. Now, even though the objective, my manoeuvring, even though the objective of the Greek armies in 1921 was to secure this zone, they knew fully well that to do that, they would have to push up, literally up to here, or to push out Turkish guerrillas. That was a very, very difficult, expensive, and problematic task in itself. Having said that, the Greek success was rather significant in the first years of the landing in Smyrna. As you can see up here, the Allies never gave Greece Constantinople with the Treaty of Sèvres. The Greek extension of its borders were in what we call Eastern Thrace, but just before Constantinople, because they wanted to control the straits on both sides. By controlling the straits, they were able to bring ships through trade, but more important, keep an eye on the Russians, who always saw this area as being theirs, as they do today, and they continue to do that today. So we have a military picture here of how the Greek forces were able to successfully push the Turks from one region to another, victoriously. And I say that without any biases either way, victoriously. And they were able, by the end of 1921, to reach this zone, which was about 100 to 150 kilometres outside Ankara. There are two thoughts here. What did the Turks decide to do? The first is that they allowed the Greek forces to move up, knowing fully well that they overextended themselves to this point. So I'm bringing you in. The second thinking was that they were so badly pushed back based on irregulars and they didn't have a standing army as yet, that they literally had to withdraw. My opinion is all this area here, it's largely desert. Greek forces at the time were probably overextended. That's my personal opinion. Others may have a different reading of it. So the Turks do withdraw and they focus in that region and they wait. Until this time, there was the real reality in Greece around this time that it would be the country of 5 seas and 2 continents, Asia and Europe and the 5 seas. So what we know as the megali idea, the great idea, what Venizelos was thinking of, neared reality. So you can imagine at this time what the soldiers and what the Greek population would have thought, and the enormous amount of pride they would have had. They didn't go to Asia Minor to conquer anyone. They went to Asia Minor to free another population that was there. Irrespective of what the narratives are, that's why they were. There's no difference from Macedonia, there's no difference from Crete, there's no difference from Cyprus. So this was the picture that we had. Everything changes in the November 1920 elections. In my opinion, the most significant event, if I had to track down one event and say what happened and caused the Asia Minor disaster, I would call it the November elections of 1920. Venizelos is in power from 1915. At the time, despite his liberal outlook, he was also a fairly authoritarian leader at the time. He was authoritarian because he had taken Greece into a war situation. I couldn't see him not being that, but there are different views on that perspective. The Conservatives with Wounaris win the election of 1920 in a massive surprise that no one had picked out. Completely reduces the electoral capacity of Venizelos and his liberals, and they are completely thrown out. Venizelos leaves the country out of disappointment, and then we have the reinstatement of the king. The king comes back. He continues the policy, the military policy. But what do? And I go back to the National Schism. What do? They start to purge the army. So they purge the experienced officers because they are Venizelos, and they replace them with monarchists. It is a classic Greek tragedy. It is truly a schism, and it's truly a clash. Now, my friends enter the game. The Bolsheviks, who in 1917 create the Soviet Union. They, because they are in great opposition to the French and to the English, decide to side with the Turks. But they don't only side, they provide arms and they provide gold bullion to supply their armies and to provide them with financial support. Kemal Ataturk knows this, and what he does, he creates the first pact with them. And by doing so, he secures his eastern borders. In the meantime, Greek communist agents are working behind the Greek army's lines to sabotage them. And they did that because they saw the war as an imperialist war. They did not see the war as a nationalist liberation conflict. So don't have any romantic notions about the Greek communists at this time. And as I showed you previously, the Greeks had reached the river Sakarya, which was in today, it's part of Turkish history, Turkish myth and mythology. They have huge ceremonies there where they say they defeated the Greek army. That's partly correct, but not fully correct. What happens is the Turkish parliament in Ankara realises that we're either going to defend here or lose. So they replace their existing military leader and they put Mustafa Kemal, who was the hero from the Western Front at Gallipoli, and they put Fevzi Cemal Kaçmak in charge, and they bring the Greek forces 200 kilometres. There is no food, and there are virtually no bullets left. So the Greek armed forces dug in Sakarya. Now, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here, but I don't want to overemphasise or underemphasise what happened here. 21-day battle takes place. Both armies are in stalemate. The most fiercest war and the most fiercest battles that took place even after the First World War were recorded here. Historians now acknowledge that the First World War ended here. This is a lithograph of what someone obviously imagined a conflict. And as you can see, it's just a big clash. But the battle was not determined by how large one army was over the other. The Greeks had more men and appeared to be more experienced. What happened was they were the first, after the brutality of this stalemate, to withdraw. That was the difference. They withdrew first. By withdrawing first, morale dropped, and what you had them exposed. But there was another consequence of this. The other consequence of this is that the Italians, the French and the British then realised, oops, we're going to back the other horse now. We're not going to back the Greeks any longer because we think they're going to lose. So the French and the British, well, the British will remain last, I take it back. The French and the Italians withdraw from those territories under Serbs. They also supply them as well. The Russians continue to provide them with bullion and support, and the Greeks then start to withdraw with the thinking we're going to go back to Smyrna, to that zone. Kemal Atatürk has the advantage here. And I dug this photo up because I thought to give you an example of how geopolitics works. He's not amongst Turks here, he's amongst Turks and Soviet advisors. So just in case anyone has any romantic notions again. Anyway, bottom line is the forces withdraw. It's a rout. The Greek forces lose a sense of momentum. They don't have those experienced soldiers, officers that are there. Smyrna falls quickly. Venizelos does not send ships to Smyrna to pick up the population deliberately because he wants them to remain in Asia Minor. So this is how you have a scenario of where you're able to extend to such a point and then to withdraw back so quickly. What is the aftermath? The aftermath is the Treaty of Lausanne that was signed in 1922-23, and its impact was a compulsory exchange of populations. Kemal did not want Christian populations remaining in Turkey, and yet Turkey is not created yet. Not created yet. We didn't know its dimensions, but what its dimensions would be at this time would be the borders, the area that borders with Russia, right up to the Aegean Sea. That became Turkey. People have argued, well, you invaded Turkey. No, they didn't invade Turkey because there was no Turkey. These were the spoils that remained after the Ottoman Empire fell. The same argument could be placed, what is Greece? The Greek state could have been what it was in 1832, and that was it. So let's not talk about nations or countries at the moment. Once it's formalised, it becomes a state. And Turkey, in 2 years, will have its 100-year anniversary in 2023 in October, where the Turkish state, the Republic, was proclaimed. So we have a population exchange. We have Turkish speakers of Orthodox faith moving into Greece, and we have about 300,000 to 400,000 Muslims exchange going to Turkey. And we also have Greek-speaking Muslims leaving Crete and going to Turkey. Both involuntary. Whether you liked it or not, there was no bargaining power in Lausanne. By that time, Venizelos had come back. Were there massacres on the way? Absolutely, on all sides. On all sides. Have no romantic notions about that. There were massacres of villages done by Greeks and the reverse done by Turks. But one of the great tragedies at the time was that as a scapegoat, they had the trial of the six. Now, our generation may not know that, but older generations are aware of it. So, to blame someone for that failure, they executed six that they held responsible, which in my opinion shouldn't have happened and was a tragedy, and I think that's acknowledged today by modern day historians. But I'll leave you decide that in your reading. Turkish Republic is established. The trial of the six that took place and the upcoming dictatorships that took place after Asia Minor were Republican monarchist, poured the fire on this event, which was the Greek Civil War. So what you have is you have bitterness, you have polarization, you have schism, and that schism translated into the Greek Civil War after the Asia Minor disaster. That's where its origins lie. The origins of the Greek Civil War were not communist versus non-communist in the beginning. They were based on a national schism based on pro and anti-monarchist elements in the deep state, in the army, in the civil service, and in the average population. The north, as I said, was Venizelos. The south was largely monarchist. We have coup after counter-coup, and we also have the rise in 1918-19 of the Greek Communist Party that puts a foothold in Greece after the Soviet Union is created. Make no mistake, the Greek Communist Party at the time was a branch of the Soviet Communist Party. The mother were the Soviets. Very briefly, I'll go through some of the phases of the Greek Civil War, then we'll get into the detail. The first phase was from 1940 to 1943, so we have the invasion of the Nazis. The second phase was from 1943, the Italians leave, they change sides, to 1944, the December riots in Athens. And I'll come back to all that. Then from 1945 to 1947, we have the Varkiza Agreement, which ends the conflict, at least on paper, where the Greek communists hand their arms and so forth. And the final is what we call O Tritos Gyros, the final round, where the communists are defeated in the Pindus Mountains. I'm going to come back here to the role of the communists because this in my opinion, is critical. And the issue of collaboration. When the Second World War broke out, the first collaborators were the Nazis and the communists together. They split Poland, they took the Baltic states, the Soviet Union, and they attacked Finland. At one point, Stalin had sent a letter to Hitler congratulating him on taking over Paris. He even, at that time, wanted to have secret agreements with the Japanese to be on their side. But the critical point for me is not that. The critical point for me is that until the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union in mid-1941, communist resistance was frugal, was non-existent. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen. When the Germans came into Greece, they emptied the jail of the Greek communists. They let them free. The Germans did that. So again, I come to ideology and geopolitics. So that's the picture that we have. So we don't have the resistance movement that we thought. The same with the French. Make no mistakes. Everyone picked up arms after, not before. I'll come back to the outcomes later. Let's talk about the narratives. What is the narrative in popular culture and the narrative amongst historians? First narrative, and that's a narrative after the Greek Civil War, that the communists were out to conquer Greece and create a communist state. That's narrative one. That narrative still held the position till at least the fall of the junta. Narrative two. After the fall of the junta, the narrative is we were pushed by the Western Allies and the anti-communists in Greece, and we were pushed to the mountains, which led to us being forced to fight you. We didn't want to, but we were pushed. The third narrative, which is now a revisionist, if you like, is no, you started the war, you killed off your opponents, you created a red terror, and those that suffered under that red terror were largely the villagers and the people in old Greece, in the Peloponnese. But later, you took revenge and you created the White Terror, which was an anti-communist insurgency, which involved every man and his dog and every extremist. Now, there is a very eminent historian here in Adelaide, David Close, who writes about the origins of the Civil War. If you have time and you're interested, I would try and purchase his book. It's called The Origins of the Greek Civil War. He talks about this, but one has to be very, very careful about historians. All of us have got our biases. He puts the concept of the Red Terror, he buries it in points that you can't see it. The implication then is that the communists were pushed to civil war. I'll let you decide that. As you can see, I have my own biases on that. In this picture is a picture of largely starving children. So between 1940 and 1941, Greece lost about 100,000 just children in Athens, largely based on the blockade of the Germans, but also of the British. There was no food coming in. Until Red Cross parcels arrived, these kids had starved. So it suffered significantly, I would say, after Poland, which copped the brunt, Yugoslavia, Greece was probably the next one, but they did suffer significantly. Athens alone had the loss of 100,000 children. The Slav Macedonians, by this time, by 1943, had created their own guerrilla movements and were fighting with the communists, and we'll talk about that later, for what they thought was a separate state. And that separate state was going to incorporate what we call Macedonia, Fyrom, and in theory a part of Bulgaria. That didn't happen for a range of reasons, and we'll talk about that later. So there's some of the players, but I do want to talk about, and I want to be as controversial as possible if I can. I talked about collaboration. In my opinion, there wasn't really collaboration as we know it, but there was self-interest. So when the Germans arrive as occupiers, what they do is they implement a military regime, they implement a security regime, the SS, and then they implement a civil government. In most countries, one would call it collaboration. But don't look at the word collaboration today and compare the word collaboration with them. So, there was a government in Greece that collaborated with the Germans. I would not call them pro-Germans and I would not call them Nazis. There were, and this is a very controversial area that very few have talked about, at least publicly, is the establishment of security battalions. The Greek state, under the collaborationist government, created about 6 battalions. And these battalions were anti-communist battalions. The thinking was that, one, when the Germans leave, we're going to get slaughtered if we can't defend ourselves. That's one. 2, contrary to popular myth and the mythology of many, these battalions were started and had officers that were actually Republicans, not monarchists. I say that again. They were Republicans, not monarchists. And when they were established, the thinking was, by Bagalos, who was a former dictator, that we've got to put these battalions in place so the king won't be able to return. How ironic. But they turned out to be the front line against the communists. And the security battalions were the first line of attack by the communists. So what prompted their creation apart from the political considerations? Very easy, which at times is omitted in the literature, is the butchering, the massacres, and the oppression of the South, which was largely monarchist. Join us or you're gone. That was basically the line. So many villages, many people had to create self-defense. The British, the Americans, and even the Russians said that these security battalions were highly pro-British and pro-Allied. Were they disfamed after and during the war? Absolutely. Was it justified to a point? Yes, it was. But I'm giving you the other side of the coin as well. They had to compete against the Red Terror. As you can see here, I think on one of the sides hung with a poster there saying that he was a traitor. Which traitor, which side, who knows? The Greek Civil War, at the end, and I didn't go through this and I apologise for that, when those who joined the Armen Elas, which was the main Greek communist movement, they were largely anti-monarchists that joined them. So they didn't go and join resistance movements that were perceived to be on the right. All the Venizelos moved after to the left because the left promised them an opposition to monarchy. But by 1947, however, what had happened is that elements of Eamelas and other ads turned into an alliance of non-communists that included monarchists, republicans, liberals, and so forth. So that's where the National Schism tore the country. Now, I haven't touched upon the depth of this. It will take conferences and discussions, but I've given you a very brief outline of the connection. So whoever was against the king sided with the left, largely, in the beginning, and whoever wished the king sided against him. But after 1947, when the Greek communists in the literature made an attempt to take power, then many people sided against them. Left and sided. So you had non-communists versus communists. And that's where the black and white, the polarisation came in. The Greek Civil War does not end until 1974 in the minds of most people in the Greek Communist Party. became a legal entity, and Karamanlis, as you see here, gave them legality. I come to this event, and I've missed Cyprus, I'll come back later, to make the point why this is a key marker too. What the European Union did, Greece's entry in 1981, was not to have an economic benefit. That was a secondary benefit. The reason why Karamanlis joins the EU is to stop dictatorships in Greece, to stop instability, and to have a political agency ready to catch Greece if it was ever in trouble with the Turks. That's what is logic. By joining the EU, whether we agree or disagree with the ups and downs of Greek politics, there has been stability since 81. Enormous amount of stability for Greek politics. Greek governments exchange once they lose, and they allow the others to come in. Until 1974, you either had a conservative right, a centrist right, or an incompetent dictatorship taking over. So that was the objective. And the impact today is that Greece, and I say this in theory, should have leverages in its foreign relations and its ability to secure its borders. And then there's yesterday, or the day before, the Greek foreign minister, in many of his speeches, made reference to the European Union. Why are you doing this? The Turks say. Well, we're doing this because we're abiding by international law. Why are you going with this agreement? We're doing this because we're abiding with international law. Greece sees Europe as its benefactor, if you like, or its security agent. To what extent that's true, time will tell. So I've thrown this in terms of the European Union. Very significant event. And it's from this time that we get a whole range of publications about the Greek Civil War coming out, because people were allowed to be a bit freer in what they wrote. And there's a whole bunch of literature now, but I recommend David Close from Adelaide University. This is Cyprus. Now, I thought that this documentary is probably better explain what happened in Cyprus than myself. That gave you an indication of what happened in Cyprus. Sometimes pictures I suppose images are more powerful, but it gives you an example of some of the weaknesses. And some of the weaknesses that were there was there's no air force. Greece did not send any air force out. If there was an air force, they would have had an opportunity to counter the Turkish army on its landing. The other second tragic mistake that Karamanlis made, that he came into power after the junta, he said Cyprus is too far. He said that, behind that was, we're not ready to fight. That's basically what happened on that. But in my opinion, as I said last time, that was a shameful event on behalf of the Greek state, and one that still haunts us today. I just wanted to thank you again for making the time.